Hello, I'm streaming executive producer Thomas Mates. Today we have a special conversation on a historic day. Today, President elect Donald Trump was sentenced in the New York City hush money trial, of which he was convicted, making him the first president elect to be sentenced for a crime, and he will be the first president to serve with a felony conviction. To talk more about the historical significance of that, we are joined by UCF history professor and News 6 political analyst Jim Clark. Jim, how are you doing today?
I am great. Thank you, Tom.
Excellent. So, Jim, as I said, this is a bit of a historic day. It's perhaps not the first time we've seen a president, or certainly not a politician, involved in some sort of criminality, but this is a first for a president about to take office. Can you first start just by telling us exactly what this trial was about and the conviction that followed?
Sure. The president, according to the prosecution, had an affair with a porn star named Stormy Daniels, and then he paid her off, which is not a crime in itself, but he took the money from campaign funds, and that is a crime in itself. And so kind of a technicality more than anything. But the New York District Attorney for Manhattan decided to go after the president. And because the president had written a large number of checks, 34 checks, he was charged with 34 counts, which made it seem much more serious. Had he written one check, there had only been one count. And the jury found him guilty. The President Trump tried to delay the process that happened today, even appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court, which turned him down in a 5-4 decision. And so he was sentenced today.
And so that sentencing is a little unusual for someone with a felony conviction, but being that this is itself an unusual case involving a president elect, what exactly is Trump now facing? The short story is that there's no actual penalty, but he could face some, at least, his legacy will be at least marred.
Yeah, well, he is a convicted felon. And so, critics can, over the next 4 years, can constantly refer to him as the convicted felon, which is obviously something you don't want. However, the judge, first of all, was fairly mild in his assessment of President Trump. And there's no jail, obviously. There's no probation. There's no fine. There's no penalty, really, of any kind. It's simply the stigma of being a convicted felon.
Yes, and there being a convicted felon does itself come with some restrictions. I'm looking at some of the coverage we had earlier today. For instance, he will not be able to possess a firearm, which is perhaps unusual for a Republican president. And then also he will have to submit a DNA sample, correct?
Yeah, that's the plan, that he has to submit a DNA sample. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. You'll remember that they did not require him to take a mugshot in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So, you don't know exactly what the court is going to follow up on this. It's strange. He is a Florida resident,
Mm-hmm.
and the question is about his ability to vote in Florida. As you know, Governor DeSantis has been very strong in wanting to deny convicted felons the right to vote. But I assume that an exception will be made for President Trump.
It remains to be seen, but I would say that is perhaps a fair bet. So one thing that and one thing to note as well is that President Trump actually did not appear in court today. President-elect Trump, I should say, did not appear in court today. He appeared virtually from his residence here in Florida.
Yeah, and that was one of the things cited by the U.S. Supreme Court. He had gone to the Supreme Court and said, "Hey, I'm about to become president. This is appearing in court is an undue burden." And by a 5-4 split, the court said, yeah, you have to face the music.
Hmm.
But one of the reasons they cited was, hey, you get to do this by Zoom, so it's not a huge burden. You don't even have to leave your house. It'll just take a few minutes. And so they allowed the sentencing to go forward today.
Yes, and President-elect Trump, this hush money trial came about at a time when the president-elect, then candidate Trump, was facing potentially several court hearings, court cases in Georgia, in federal court as well. Many people thought at the time that this case, the hush money case, was perhaps the weakest, the least likely to result in a conviction, and by many accounts, critics on both sides said that it was largely political theater. However, it ended up being the only one that went forward.
Yeah, you forget. Go back 2 years when things looked really dark for Donald Trump. He had was facing indictments in Atlanta, South Florida, Washington, and New York, and basically, kind of it all has fallen apart. And that was one of the things I think that Ron DeSantis, when he ran for president, was counting on, that these charges would hurt Trump. And a lot of people think that they only serve to rally his base. So, in fact, the Democratic district attorney in Manhattan may have helped Donald Trump quite by accident.
Hmm. And so now a lot of those cases have largely evaporated. Certainly the federal charges against him, especially following a Supreme Court ruling that said that presidents in the capacity of their job as president cannot be charged for official actions. And now that he is taking office again, a lot of those have gone away. However, the Georgia case is just in such disarray. What do we know about what comes next with any of these cases? There may be some reports that come out, at least in the January 6th cases or charges that were the president-elect was facing. But the confidential documents case seems to be staying just that, confidential.
Yeah. The Atlanta case has turned out to be a disaster. More questions have been raised about the prosecutor in Atlanta than have been raised about Donald Trump. It is now before the state Supreme Court as to whether she can even continue to prosecute this case. As for the federal investigations, remember, Donald Trump is about to take over the Justice Department. So, in a
Hmm.
real sense, he'll get to control any ongoing investigations into himself. So, it's unlikely that anything will happen there. So, it looks so dark for him 2 years ago with all of these charges and all of these different areas. But the New York one is the only one, it looks like, where there will be a trial and a conviction. And even there, uh, there's no penalty.
Yes, and we had mentioned that he had gone to the Supreme Court to try and delay the sentencing today, and in a lot of senses, the as president, any federal charges, as you mentioned, he would have some sway over, be able to make them go away. But in a state case, the president has exceptionally limited power because of states' rights to absolve or pardon themselves or anybody. Correct?
Yeah, and people don't understand that he has federal pardon power, but not state pardon power. So if somebody's convicted in a state court, he has no control over it. So he will be unable to pardon himself. And I doubt if the New York governor, who's a Democrat, will be issuing him a pardon anytime soon.
Yes. So as we said, though, this will ultimately result in no jail time, no probation, no more eyes on Donald Trump, at least insofar as this case is concerned. And as we mentioned, the other cases are, if they can't, likely will not move forward, and the Georgia case is in such disarray, remains to be seen what, if anything, will happen there. What comes next for Donald Trump? Is it likely that he could try to appeal this conviction, get it overturned in some way to sort of clear his record, or is he just stuck with this moniker of that will kind of haunt him through history of the only convicted felon to, so far at least, to take the presidency.
Yeah, and that is confusing also. The Supreme Court, in its ruling allowing this to go forward, said, hey, you have not exhausted all of the appeals yet. So you need to go through the state court system. He has 2 or 3 more steps to go. I imagine his lawyers will be filing papers to appeal uh, any time now. So this story is not over.
Certainly. And just a last note on the Supreme Court's decision. A lot of people may have found it somewhat unusual that the Supreme Court, where, it is a Republican leaning Supreme Court, it is at least 3 of the justices were appointed by Donald Trump himself. It may be surprising to some people that they went against the president elect. However, it's not necessarily unusual for this particular Supreme Court to have not sided with Donald Trump.
Yeah, they've had mixed results. Remember, last year they ruled that he could not be charged with crimes committed while he was president. So it looked like they were kind of in his pocket. But this ruling showed there is some independence. 2 of the conservatives, the Chief Justice, and one of his appointees voted with liberal 3 liberal justices to hand him a defeat.
Mm-hmm. And the Chief Justice has, in this current court makeup, been something of a swing vote. Generally, him and or Justice Kavanaugh have been the swing votes in this conservative court. Again, perhaps not unusual given the history that he was on the side of taking the side along with the liberal justices. As we move forward in this, as Donald Trump takes his office for the second time as the 47th president of the United States, there's a very real possibility we could see more justices appointed by President Trump.
Yes, and he got to appoint 3, and which is pretty good for 4 years. We were reminded this week that Jimmy Carter, in his 4 years, did not get to appoint a single Supreme Court justice.
Mm-hmm.
But several of the justices are getting up there in years. The most likely ones, however, are Republicans
Mm-hmm.
that he will need to replace. It's going to be interesting to see if he gets more appointees and how many he gets.
Yes, I mean, there's long been some speculation that should President Trump win election in November, which he did, that Alito and Thomas who are getting up there in the years, although it is a lifetime appointment, might, take the exit, as it were, and then allow President Trump to appoint their replacements. Who that would be remains to be seen, although we know that there have been, in a lot of Republican circles, a lot of opportunities or a lot of attempts to create, sort of short lists of people who they believe would be right for the job.
Yeah. And, people have speculated about retirements from the court, but retirements from the court are fairly unusual. We saw with Ruth Ginsburg, once you're on the Supreme Court, you like to hang on to the job.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that justices will simply step aside and, take up golf or bowling probably is not something to bet on. Usually they like to hang on to the bitter end.
Yeah, and there have been some campaigns in recent years to see older justices retire. Sort of pressure campaigns, I know, especially from the Democratic side, to make sure that the when there was a Democrat in power, for instance, President Biden appointing Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, that they would have that opportunity to ensure a more favorable makeup of the court. Again, this is coming from left-leaning activists. So far, has there been any of that from the right?
No, not that there's been no pressure at all. They are very happy with the makeup of the court, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 oldest justices are Donald Trump's greatest supporters. In fact, it was Aliota this week admitted that he had had a telephone conversation with Donald Trump shortly before ruling on this case. So Donald Trump likes the makeup of this court.
Hmm. Definitely. So we will continue to follow this, and I'm sure that it will be likely that President-elect Trump will have something to say following his sentencing coming up today or in the coming days. And we will of course bring that to you live. Professor Clark, I apologize. I stumbled over your name there. Professor Clark, thank you so much for joining us here
Thank you,
on
Tom.
News 6 Plus. We appreciate your insight and your expertise, and we'll be able to you'll be able to find all of our coverage on this ongoing story on clickorlando.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and Professor Clark, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, Tom.